One of the things that you may notice about the text that we're going to study, the Catholic epistles, is they have some names that are probably pretty familiar to you. Peter, that's a name that we immediately connect with Jesus in the New Testament. He's sort of like Jesus' right hand man. He is the leader of the disciples, and yet also in some ways the one who most represents everybody reading it. He has foot and mouth disease, is always saying the wrong thing or is jumping off the handle, and yet he is the example of faith. And Jesus says, on this around this rock or this kind of faith, I'll build my church. And he gives Simeon the name Peter, or Caiaphas, which is rock. So he basically gives him the nickname of Rocky, and that's how we know him today. You would think that a text that is written, or at least has an early apostolic association with somebody that close to Jesus, wouldn't be tucked away in the back of the New Testament. Then there's James. The traditionally assumed authorship of James is the half-brother of Jesus, James, the son of Joseph and Mary, who, as you know from Acts, becomes the leader of the early church in Jerusalem. Even more so than Peter, it's James who is the decision maker, and James who can make things move in one way or the other. In the Gospels, he's a skeptic. He doesn't believe that his half-brother, or who he's thought of as a full brother, Jesus, was God's Messiah. He doesn't believe, and he's not a follower. And yet after the resurrection, at a very early point, by the time Paul's active, James is the pillar of the church in Jerusalem. And yet his book is again tucked away in the back of the New Testament. We have 3 letters from John. Now these letters could be written from the same author who writes the Gospel of John. I'm actually one of the scholars who says that it's probably the same author, because there's so many similar ideas, there's so many similar linguistic expressions. There's a flow of thought that's very connected from the Gospels to the letters. It so happens that three letters may have arrived as a connection. One of them as a private letter for the pastor or a group of pastors in a region. The other one for a letter as an introduction to a letter. And First John itself as a letter that's written for everybody. So there's a little bit of complexity with exactly how the letters fit together. With First John being the one with the most meat or the most content to it. It's the most important for our studies. But if this is the same John that wrote the Gospel of John, or another one of the early Johns like the writer of Revelation, we're again surprised to find this at the back of the New Testament. Same thing with Jude, who's another half-brother of Jesus. And his book is hidden away here at the back, and how many people have ever read it? Why did this happen? You would think that these first foundational believers, who from the end of the first century, start of the second century, at least the middle part of the second century, these books were closely associated with them as the author, would be given a more prominent place. Why aren't they? Let's think about when the canon begins to be formed. The canon begins to be formed in the 300s, when everything is kind of coalescing into its final forms. At that time, Christianity was thoroughly divorced from its Jewish roots. It just wasn't connected anymore. So the writings of Paul that present the gospel in Gentile or in Greek and Greco-Roman terms that are not rooted in a Jewish foundation are a little bit more accessible and are a little bit more treasured at that point. All of the books that we would think of as the Catholic epistles are considered to be more Jewish in nature and flavor in what they teach. Some of these books certain church leaders have hated. Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation, when churches began to break away from Roman Catholicism due to some abuses that were present, that were happening at that time. People were being required to sort of pay an indulgence so they could go out and sin, or they'd have to give an offering to get a loved one's soul from a place between heaven and hell, purgatory. They could speed up the process through giving a donation. There was lots of abuses and things that were going on, and Luther and others led the Reformation in the 1500s. That broke away from the Catholic Church. Martin Luther hated the book of James. He called it an epistle of straw, and he said the whole thing should have been taken out of the New Testament long ago. Hated the book because Luther followed Paul's emphasis on justification and salvation, being made right with God, being saved purely on the basis of faith, of believing in Jesus. Whereas James says, what good is your faith if you don't have works? Can your faith without works save you? No, faith without works is dead, and it can't save anybody. So James says, put your money where your mouth is, and show me, don't just tell me. And some people have had problems with that. These are steeped in Old Testament thought patterns. They're steeped in Hebraic expressions. So as the church became less and less ethnically, culturally, and religiously connected to its Hebraic roots, it becomes more and more a Gentile movement. So these books have less prominence by the time that the canon achieves its final form, which is unfortunate because their content is excellent. As we look at these books this week, there's a couple of things that you're going to notice. There's an emphasis on belief that is different than the Pauline text. For Paul, believing happens here. We come to accept a certain set of concepts or a certain presupposition about Jesus. Jesus is the Son of God. He's the propitiatory, the offering that takes away the sin of humankind. He's God's agent in doing this. By believing in his death and resurrection as an intellectual activity, we're come to believe in it through the will, through the mind, and through a response to that. That's where salvation comes from. This presents it very differently, where belief is a whole person response. Where in the Catholic epistles, you're not really able to say that you believe something unless you also live in accordance to that belief. And a colloquial kind of way of looking at it would be like Chicken Little. You remember Chicken Little, and the story runs around and he says, "The sky is falling, the sky is falling." Well, if someone's doing that and they don't take cover to protect themselves from the falling sky, they don't take any activity or any action to actually show that they believe that, we would have doubts about whether they even believed what they said. These books emphasize the role of works in salvation, that a person's response to believing in Jesus is actually what constitutes true and proper belief, that it's not just something that's here, but it's something that's lived out. So that's a very common theme in all of these. Also, these books are universal in scope, whereas Paul's letters are written, to the church at Rome, to the saints at Colossae, or to a specific group of people that may have been shared later. These we don't have the benefit of knowing that about. Some of them, particularly like 1st and 2nd Peter, are intentionally written to get around. They're intentionally written to be shared among different groups of churches, different Christian groups. They're meant to be a universal letter. When we use the term for these Catholic epistle, again, it's not like Roman Catholicism in the way that we would use that term for that branch of Christianity, but Catholic means universal in its root. So these are letters that are intentionally universal. These are for all of the saints. And they particularly found a strong circulation among those early Jewish Christian communities and later on flowed out into others. So as we explore the facets of these, it is important for you to know that these are much more connected to Hebraic thought patterns. Now, the authorship of some of these is dubious, particularly with 2nd Peter. That's the most suspect of all of these books as having probably been written by someone else. You may have also encountered this in some of your readings about Paul, but one of the questions that comes up sometimes in New Testament studies is the question of pseudonymous authorship. If you've ever heard of Dr. Seuss, that was not Dr. Seuss's real name. That was a pseudonym, a pen name that he assumed to write his books. Now, this works a little bit differently, where in the New Testament world, around that time period, if you needed authority to what you were saying, sometimes someone would write something as if they were someone who was respected. So they're writing this in the style of Paul and claiming it's from Paul, or they're doing this, writing the second letter of Peter as if it's a follow-up to the first one that's gotten around and had already been accepted. We don't know for absolute certain that all of these books have an authentic authorship, that they're all written by the persons by whom they purport to be written by. And 2nd Peter is by far the most suspect of all of them. To actually, of all the books in the New Testament, it is the most suspect to have a pseudonymous authorship. So there may be someone else who's a pseudepigrapher out there kind of claiming to be Peter, and you're going to notice that the literary features of that book are kind of different than everything else in the New Testament, and even quite different from 1st Peter. This conversation gets complicated, and it also plays into that book's lower place in the canon, if you will, placed more towards the back, the emphasized place, because they knew this from a very, very early period. Eusebius, the church's first historian, writing in the early 3rd century, says, there's also the second epistle of Peter, so-called epistle of Peter, which we don't receive to be inspired, but some do because they found it useful, so we've just left it included. And that's how he explains its inclusion. So that's a less than enthusiastic endorsement. Writing just a couple of decades later, St. Jerome, who would really shape the translation of the New Testament and the Bible as a whole into Latin so it can go throughout the Roman world. And it was the Latin Vulgate translation that was used for millennia after Jerome. He, in one of his letters instructing a Christian woman, Heldiba, says to her that we pretty much know that this is not really from Peter, but it's been accepted, and there's some useful things in here, so we kind of just hang on to it. It's pretty unfathomable, even to Jerome's thought at that early period, that someone who's an uneducated fisherman like Peter could have been able to use language that properly belongs in Homer or in high classical Greek literary works. While again, with God nothing is impossible, some things are just not likely. So let's remember that when it comes to the canon, is the important thing who inspired it or who wrote it. So as we look through these texts, there's going to be some things that you find that may be interesting features. You're going to notice that more than any other book in the Bible, James looks and feels and sounds a lot more like Proverbs, but has a little more bite than Proverbs. It's a collection of wise sayings. They're not particularly well organized. They kind of go back and forth on one another, whereas the letters of Peter have a little bit more organization, particularly 2 Peter, which is super stylish. 1 John repeats a lot of the same themes. That guy has a one-track mind, and it is love each other. And here's what love looks like in the Christian community. All of these works are connected by a couple of things. They are concerned about promoting correct belief and correct practice of the Christian life. So not only just belief, but also a way of life. That's a proper response to the saving initiatives of God and Jesus. They're very, very concerned with showing us the proper way to do that. And they kind of each have their own take on spelling that out, what that looks like. All of them also, and this is something they share even with Paul, have an emphasis that the zenith, the greatest point of development you can get to in the Christian life, is agape love. And if you remember, agape love is that self-sacrificing, self-donating, giving love that gives on behalf of the beloved one. So that's the way that people who are in faith are supposed to be, and there's a moral progression for how you get there. There's also a concern for response to suffering. Apparently, by the time these books were getting around, many early Christian communities were beginning to be persecuted locally, or perhaps more systematically in some cases under the Neronian persecutions in the 60s. We don't exactly know, but he continues to mention their suffering because of the gospel. All of the authors refer to that. So these Christians were going through a difficult time that's made more difficult because they're Christians, and they're beginning to view that as an opportunity to respond to that as a work of witness. So those are some facets that you're going to see as we move through here, and just kind of enjoy the ride.